The bell over the door at Kensington Arms and Tactical rang a clean, high note, the kind that carries through a house long after the door has shut, and the first thing that crossed the threshold behind it was cold air and the smell of hay. Why an old farmer would keep a folded leather clasp wrapped in a handkerchief in his coat pocket instead of just carrying it loose was not a question anyone in the shop that morning thought to ask, because nobody in the shop that morning thought about Harlan Sowell at all, until Preston Kensington glanced up from the display counter and said, loud enough for the two customers by the ammunition wall to hear, "Careful, folks, the petting zoo just opened." Harlan didn't quicken his step. He never did. 76 years old, moving with the unhurried economy of a man who had long since stopped spending energy he didn't need to spend, he crossed into the fluorescent light in a canvas feed and seed coat, gone the color of creek clay, patched soft at both elbows, and nobody in that glass-cased rifle-bright room would have guessed that the item riding in his breast pocket, a $2 leather clasp with a serial number stamped into its underside, was about to be worth more to Preston Kensington than the $40,000 a month his shop was grossing, more than the franchise contract sitting, signed in waiting on his desk, with a photographer already booked for Thursday, more, in the end, than his father's name on the wall. At the far end of the indoor range, behind a chain-link kennel run, polished to look rustic for customers who liked their tactical gear served with a side of Americana, the shop's young Malinois went rigid. Ears up, weight forward onto both front paws. A dog trained to hold a sit-stay through gunfire and shouted commands came up off his haunches the instant the bell finished ringing, and nobody, not Preston, not the clerk restocking holsters, not the two men admiring a rack of hunting rifles under glass, turned to look at him do it. Only the dog watched the old man walk in. If you've ever been written off for how you looked walking through a door, type steady in the comments. 2 days. That was what the calendar taped inside Preston's office door said, red marker circling a Thursday noon, the word signing beneath it, and under that, in his father's own looping hand, copied a decade into a marketing binder like scripture, the line Preston had quoted to 3 separate radio stations that year. A shop built on trust, the way trust used to be built. He believed it. That was the strange, unbearable thing about it. The thing that would take 2 days and 1 dog and 1 dead woman's forgotten kindness to unwind. Preston Kensington was not a liar. He had simply never once needed to ask where his own origin story came from, and no man who has never had to ask a question can be blamed, yet, for not knowing the answer. Harlan didn't go toward the counter. He went, as he did every Wednesday that the shop had been open, past the ammunition wall to a bargain bin near the back, where second-hand rifle slings and surplus gear cases sat tangled together, priced to move, and rarely moved. He didn't buy anything. He hadn't in the 4 years he'd been coming, not since the week after Opal's funeral, when he'd walked past the shop on his way to the feed store and heard, faintly, through a propped door, a bell that rang the same pitch as the one that used to hang over her kitchen door, tapped by the wind whenever somebody left the porch too fast. He'd stood outside a full minute that first time, then he'd gone in, and he'd been coming back ever since, on no schedule but his own, touching gear he didn't need, with hands that had once known exactly what every buckle and clasp on a working harness was for. He lifted a canvas sling case now, turned it over, set it down exactly where he'd found it. His fingers, thick-knuckled, the nails clean, but the skin gone the color and grain of old rope, moved along the stitching the way another man might read a paragraph, checking the seams for wear, the D-rings for rust, out of habit rather than need. Near the back of the store, past the bargain bin, a chain-link kennel run held the shop's demonstration dog when he wasn't working the floor, and Harlan's left hand, without any command from the rest of him, opened, fingers spread, palm turned down and slow, the exact stillness of a man calming a horse, or asking a frightened animal to wait 1 more second before anything else happens. He wasn't looking at the kennel. He didn't need to. Some part of him that had never fully come home from a war 51 years gone still ran on an old current, and that current didn't care what the calendar said. He touched his coat pocket then, the way he did a dozen times an hour without noticing he did it, fingers finding the small, hard rectangle of the wrapped clasp through the canvas, the way another man might touch a wallet or a rosary, confirming it was there, never once drawing it out. He did not open it in the shop. He had not opened it, in fact, in longer than most of the people in that building had been alive. Then he moved toward the front, past the glass case of hunting rifles catching the fluorescent light in long, cold bars, and stopped, as he always stopped, in front of the framed photograph mounted center wall between two mounted deer heads and a banner reading, "Founded on Trust." The photograph showed a young man in fatigues crouched beside a Malinois, both of them caught mid-turn toward whatever had called their attention off camera, the dog's ears pinned back in that particular way. Dog's ears pinned back only around gunfire or grief. Beneath it, a brass plate read, "The original handler and dog, the legacy begins." Harlan read it, as he read it every Wednesday, without moving his lips. His jaw set, his right hand rose halfway to his chest, toward the pocket with the clasp, and stopped there, suspended, before falling back to his side. He said nothing. He never did. He turned from the photograph the way a man turns from a grave he visits often enough that the visiting no longer needs comment, and he went on browsing gear he wouldn't buy, in a store that didn't know yet what it owed him. Preston Kensington had a good eye for a photograph, which was, he liked to say, the whole difference between a gun shop and a brand. He stood now at the front counter angling a tripod toward the light, checking the glare off the rifle case through his phone screen, while Logan Beall, 22, sharp-eyed under a shop apron 2 sizes too big, restocked a rack of ear protection nearby and half-listened to his boss narrate his own genius. "Thursday, they'll want 3 shots minimum," Preston said, mostly to himself, tapping 2 fingers against the display glass in the rhythm he always tapped before a pitch, a habit inherited, like the slogans, from his father. Wide shot of the floor, tight shot of the wall, and Bracken doing something that looks like discipline instead of a trick, because discipline is what sells a franchise, Logan, not tricks. 40 locations are betting on this shop, looking exactly like what my father built it to look like. He glanced up, caught sight of Harlan drifting past the bargain bin toward the back a second time, and exhaled through his nose, the particular sound of a man recalculating a schedule around an inconvenience. And somebody's going to have to keep the world's oldest loss prevention risk away from the display cases before the photographer gets here. Logan didn't laugh. He glanced toward Harlan, then back, careful. He comes in most Wednesdays, never touches anything wrong. "I'm not saying he's touching anything wrong," Preston said, in the tone of a man already sure he'd won the point. "I'm saying a guy in a coat that smells like a barn standing next to a case of $1,000 rifles is not the vibe 40 regional managers need to see in a walkthrough video. Go ask him to step back from the glass. Nice, easy. Point him at the clearance bin. He seems to like the clearance bin." Logan went, and did it kindly enough, and Harlan, without argument, without even much change in his face, took 1 step back from the case he hadn't been leaning on and returned his attention to a sling he'd already turned over twice. Preston didn't watch this exchange. He had already turned to the small crowd gathering near the range door, drawn the way crowds are always drawn by the sight of a man in a polo shirt clipping a lead onto a serious-looking dog, and he raised his voice into the register he used for customers, warm and performative, carrying easily over the hum of the ventilation system. "Folks, if you've got 2 minutes, you're about to see 6 years of training." He led Bracken out from behind the counter on a loose lead, the young Malinois moving with the coiled, watchful grace of a dog who has been taught that every eye in the room is part of the job. This is Bracken, born right here in the county, trained on site, and about to become the face of 40 new stores across 3 states. He said it like his father used to say it, cadence and all, and the 2 customers by the ammunition wall drifted closer, phones already lifting. A woman near the counter smiled at the dog the uncomplicated way people smile at handsome animals. Preston set Bracken into a sit, with a hand signal sharp enough to look impressive on camera, and the dog obeyed instantly, ears up, eyes forward, every inch the finished product of a story Preston had never once had reason to question. Harlan watched from the bargain bin without turning his head fully toward the demonstration, the particular sideways attention of a man who has spent a lifetime learning not to look directly at what he's actually watching. His left hand, resting on the edge of the bin, opened once, palm down, fingers spread, and closed again. Logan, restocking 3 feet away, noticed it and didn't know why he noticed it, only that something about the gesture looked less like an old man's twitch and more like the first half of a sentence. "Down," Preston said, and Bracken dropped, elbows flat, chin nearly to the floor, a clean, disciplined motion that drew a small ripple of approval from the gathering crowd. "Stay." He stepped back 3 paces, arms wide for the camera he hadn't turned on yet, grinning at the little audience the way a man grins when he already knows how the story ends. This is what 6 years of the right bloodline and the right training program gets you. This dog has never once broken a stay in front of a customer. He said it exactly like that, a fact and a promise both, tapping 2 fingers once against his own thigh in place of the display glass, and it did not occur to him, standing 3 feet from a photograph of a man and a dog he had never bothered to learn the real names of, that he had just described, without knowing it, a claim about to be broken in front of everyone he was trying to impress. Preston ran Bracken through the sequence twice more for the photographer's benefit. Sit, down, stay, heel. Each command crisp and each response clean, and the little crowd by the range door grew by 2 more customers drawn in off the sidewalk by the sight of people watching something. He was good at this part, and it would have been dishonest to say otherwise. His hands were quick, his timing was clean, and the dog trusted him in the ordinary way dogs trust a competent handler who feeds them and walks them and has never once been cruel. Harlan, from the bargain bin, watched this with the flat, unhurried attention of a man reading weather, and when Preston brought Bracken up from a down into a heel with a hand motion too fast and too low, snapping his fingers instead of opening his palm, the dog hesitated a half-second too long, ears sliding sideways in confusion before catching up to the command. Nobody else in the room seemed to notice. Harlan did. He said, quietly, not raising his voice above the hum of the range vents, not stepping forward. "Palm up when he's coming out of a down. He's reading your hip before your hand." It was the only thing he'd said aloud since he'd walked through the door, and it landed in the room the way a dropped coin lands in an empty hallway, small and clear and easy to ignore. Preston glanced over, more amused than annoyed, the particular indulgent amusement of a young man who has just been corrected by someone he has already decided doesn't count. "He's fine," he said, to the crowd more than to Harlan, and ran the sequence again, exactly the same way, and Bracken hesitated exactly the same half-second, and Preston didn't see it, because he was watching his own hands and not the dog's ears. Logan saw it, though. He'd stopped restocking altogether now, hip against the ear protection rack, watching Harlan instead of the demonstration, because Harlan wasn't watching Preston at all. He was watching Bracken's ears, and Bracken's tail, and the set of Bracken's shoulders, with the kind of total, unblinking focus Logan had only ever seen grown men give to something they were about to bet money on. The old man's face didn't change, but his attention had a shape to it, a stillness that wasn't absence, and Logan found himself thinking, with the sudden clarity young men sometimes get about older strangers, that the old farmer in the feed store coat was reading that dog the way Logan's grandfather used to read a sky before a storm, seeing weather nobody else in the room had learned yet to feel. "You know dogs?" Logan asked, low, mostly to himself, and didn't expect an answer, and didn't get one. Harlan's hand rested on the bargain bin, open, palm down, very still, and 3 feet away, Bracken's tail gave one slow sweep against the floor, once, in a motion that had nothing to do with any command Preston had given. Preston clipped Bracken's lead back on for the final pass, the one he meant to actually film, angling the phone in his other hand toward the light the way he'd angled the tripod earlier, and said, to the now considerable knot of customers by the range door, "Last one, and this is the good one. Full recall from a distance, no lead, no treats, pure discipline." He walked Bracken to the far end of the range floor, unclipped him there, and jogged back toward the crowd, with the easy showmanship of a man who has done this exact sequence for exactly this kind of audience before. He turned, lifted his hand, and called the dog's name the way he'd been calling it for 6 years. "Bracken, here!" The dog came off his sit-stay clean and fast, exactly as trained, and for 3 full strides, he ran the line Preston expected, straight toward his handler's open hand and the little gathered crowd, and the camera lifted to catch it. Then, at the 4th stride, he broke. Not a stumble, not confusion, a decision, visible in the shoulders, a hard, clean pivot that took him diagonally across the range floor, past Preston's raised hand, past the phone still filming, past 2 customers who stepped back, without knowing why they'd stepped back, straight to where Harlan Sowell stood at the bargain bin, with his left hand open at his side. Bracken did not slow as he approached. He arrived and folded himself down into a sit against Harlan's left leg, shoulder pressed to the old man's shin, in a position so exact, so drilled, so instantly and completely correct that even the customers who knew nothing about dog training understood, on some wordless level, that they were watching a shape that had been built, not accidental. "Bracken, here!" Preston called again, sharper, an edge of real confusion cutting through the showman's polish, and the dog's ears flicked once toward his voice and did not otherwise move. The room went quiet, in the particular way a room goes quiet when it senses it has misunderstood something it was very sure of a moment ago. Somewhere behind the ammunition wall, a customer's phone kept recording, forgotten in her hand. Harlan hadn't spoken. He hadn't moved beyond the single opening of his palm, a gesture so small most of the room hadn't caught it. An old field signal held low against his thigh, 2 fingers curled inward, the rest spread flat and slow. It was that signal, not Preston's voice, not Preston's name for the dog, that Bracken had answered, crossing 40 feet of range floor to obey a language nobody in that shop had ever taught him. Preston jogged back across the floor, breathing a little too hard for the distance, his easy grin gone thin at the edges. He's never done that. He's never broken a recall in his life. That dog does not break. He stopped in front of Harlan, looking down at the dog pressed against the old man's leg, then up at Harlan's face, searching for some explanation his own eyes weren't offering him. Harlan looked down at the dog for a long moment. Something moved behind his face, brief and private, gone before it could be named. Then he said one word, quiet, almost gentle, the kind of quiet that isn't shyness but certainty. "Anvil." The dog's tail swept the floor once at the sound of it. Preston's mouth opened and nothing practiced came out of it. "That's not. His name is Bracken. He's registered as Bracken. That's on his papers. That's on the wall. That's—" He stopped again, and this time the stopping had a different shape to it, because some part of him had just heard, without wanting to, that the word the old man had used wasn't a guess, or a joke, or a stranger's mistake. It had the sound of a name that had been used before, correctly, a great many times, by someone who had earned the right to use it. The knot of customers by the range door had gone entirely still, phones lowered now without anyone deciding to lower them, watching a shop owner's practiced pitch collapse into 3 unfinished sentences in front of a dog that would not look away from an old man in a barn coat. Preston needed nearly a full minute to find words that worked in order, and when he did, they came out smaller than anything he'd said all morning. "Who are you?" Harlan didn't answer that. He rested his hand, open, on top of the dog's head, and the dog leaned into it the way a much older animal leans into a much older hand, and the room, without anyone announcing it, understood that the demonstration was over and something else had begun. Preston's phone was in his hand for a different reason now. He didn't call the photographer. He didn't call his father's old marketing number, still saved from years back under DAD's shop. He scrolled to a contact he'd added when he'd first inherited the shop, and never once had cause to call. A name kept for reference the way a man keeps an appendix he assumes will never act up, and pressed it before he'd fully decided to. "Colonel Yancey," he said, when the line picked up, his voice trying and failing to sound like the voice he used with customers. "It's Preston Kensington. I know it's early, I need you to come down to the shop. A pause, listening. No, no, it's about the franchise paperwork. And the dog. And I need you to look at something. He hung up and stood there a moment, with the phone still in his hand, staring at Bracken sitting immovable against a stranger's leg, and said, mostly to himself, mostly to the wall, "That's not funny. That's a real name. That's somebody real." 9 minutes later, a car door shut out front with the particular weight of a man who does not slam things, and the bell over the shop door rang its clean high note a second time that morning. And Colonel Norris Yancey, retired, silver-haired, still built like a man who had once carried more than his own weight up hillsides, stepped into a room gone quiet around an old farmer and a dog that would not move. Preston met him at the door talking too fast, the words tumbling ahead of any order to them. He walked in. He's been in before, Logan says every Wednesday, and Bracken just broke a full recall, in front of customers, in front of a camera, and sat on him, and he said a name that isn't on any paper we have, and I don't, he ran a hand back through his hair. You're on the franchise application as a reference, my father's reference. You knew this business from the start. Tell me this is nothing. Tell me it's coincidence. Yancey didn't answer right away. His eyes had already found Harlan across the room, and something in his posture changed before he'd taken 3 more steps toward him, a straightening that had nothing to do with military bearing and everything to do with recognition arriving faster than the mind could organize a response to it. The signing is in 2 days, Preston said, to Yancey's back now, because Yancey was walking toward Harlan and not listening to him anymore. 40 locations, Colonel, regional press. That photograph on the wall is the whole campaign. My father built this company's name on it. It is not up for, it has nothing to do with whatever this is. Preston. Yancey said it without turning around, and something in the single word made Preston stop talking. The colonel crossed the last of the floor, stopped 2 feet from Harlan, and for a moment simply looked at him, the way a man looks at a photograph he has kept somewhere and not taken out in a long time, matching a face against a memory it has outlasted by decades. That photograph, Preston said again, quieter now, less an argument than a man reciting a thing he needed to still be true, is unrelated to whatever's happening with the dog. My father took that legacy and built 40 jobs and a franchise out of nothing else but trust in his own story. You can't just... Harlan's hand went, without hurry, into his coat pocket. He drew out the small folded shape wrapped in a handkerchief, gone soft and gray with handling, and unfolded the cloth for the first time in longer than anyone standing in that room, including himself, could easily remember. Inside lay a leather clasp, cracked at its fold, a serial number stamped faint but legible into the underside of the leather, where 60 years of thumbs had worn the number nearly smooth. He held it up, not toward Preston, but toward the wall, toward the framed photograph between the 2 mounted deer heads, and said, in the plainest voice he had used all morning, "Take that frame down." Logan was already moving before Preston gave the order, lifting the photograph off its hook with both hands, careful of the mounted heads on either side, and setting it flat on the glass display counter under the fluorescent light. Harlan crossed to it, unhurried, and turned the frame over. On the cardboard backing, stamped into a metal fitting screwed into the wood decades ago and painted over since, sat a number. He held the clasp beside it. The serial matched, digit for digit, a match too exact to be coincidence and too old to be staged. "That's the harness clip off my working lead," Harlan said. 1972. "That's me in that photograph. That's my first Bracken." He turned the frame so the brass plate caught the light. "Founded on trust. Whoever engraved that plate," he said, "engraved it a long time after this picture was taken. Look at the finish on it against the frame wood. 2 colors of tarnish. That plate went on years after the photograph did." Preston reached for the frame with both hands, as if holding it himself might change what it said, and it was Colonel Yancey who spoke next, and his voice, when it came, had lost every trace of the parade ground calm it had carried through the door. "I signed that franchise application," he said it to the room, to no one, to Harlan, all at once. 9 years ago, your father's, Preston. I signed as a reference, without asking to see the original of that photograph. I told myself the paperwork was thorough enough. I told myself it wasn't my job to verify a family's own history. He looked at Harlan, and something in his jaw worked once before he got the rest of the sentence out. Sir? The word cracked down the middle, an old man's voice failing on a single formal syllable in front of a room of strangers. I let this stand for 9 years. I am so sorry. Nobody in the shop moved. The dog, still sitting against Harlan's leg, turned his head and looked up at the old man's face, as if he too were waiting to see what Harlan would do with an apology that large. Harlan looked at the colonel a long moment, the way he'd looked at the photograph every Wednesday for 4 years, without ever quite meeting its eyes, and then he did something nobody in the room expected. He reached out and rested his hand, briefly, on Yancey's shoulder, the same open, unhurried hand he'd used on the dog, and said only, "You're not the one who took the photograph, Colonel. Sit down before you fall down. We've got some talking to do." Preston sat down first, on the edge of the display counter, because his legs seemed to have decided the conversation before he had. "Then tell me," he said, and his voice had lost every trace of the salesman's cadence, gone thin and young and honest in a way Logan had never heard from him. "Tell me whose picture is actually on my wall." Harlan didn't answer right away. He looked at the frame lying face up on the glass counter, at the young man crouched in fatigues beside a dog with its ears pinned back, toward something off camera, and something in his own face, for the first time that morning, came loose. "That's me at 22, he said. 1972, outside a supply depot, 3 years before I came home for good. That's my Bracken, first Bracken." He touched the edge of the frame with one finger. Careful, the same care he used on the sling cases he never bought. "He died old, 3 years after I got back. Best years of my life, some of them, and some of the worst, standing next to that dog." He let out a breath that wasn't quite a laugh. "My wife Opal mailed this photograph into a magazine contest without telling me. 1974, maybe 75. Some publication running a feature on working dogs and their handlers. I never entered it, never wanted the attention. She thought I looked handsome in my uniform, and she was proud, and she sent it in behind my back, and I found out only because a copy of the magazine showed up in our mailbox that fall, with my own face in it." He shook his head slowly. "I was angry at her for about a day. Then I wasn't, because that's what love does. It embarrasses you a little, and you let it. I never chased down where else that photograph went after that. Never wrote the magazine. Never asked who reprinted it or sold it, or filed it in some archive somewhere. Chasing it felt like arguing with grief once she was gone, like undoing something she did out of love just to prove a point nobody left alive needed proved to them." He looked up, and for a moment his eyes went past Preston, past the colonel, toward the front door, toward the bell still hanging silent above it. "I come in here on Wednesdays," he said, "and it's not for the dog, though I expect that's what everyone's been assuming since about 9 minutes ago." He almost smiled. "That bell over your door rings the same pitch as the one that used to hang over my kitchen door, back when Opal was in it. 4 years since she passed. Some sounds you keep visiting long after the room is gone." He reached out and touched the bell's cord where it hung inside the frame of the door, once, gentle, and let it go without ringing it. "That's the whole mystery. No conspiracy in it. Just an old man following a sound." Preston sat with that a long moment, the shop quiet around him, the customers by the range door not pretending anymore that they weren't listening. "What do you want?" Preston finally said. "For the photo. For the franchise. Whatever's fair. I'll pay it. I'll credit it however you say. I'll pull the whole campaign if that's what makes this right." Harlan shook his head slowly. "Don't want money for a picture my wife mailed in for love, and I don't want my name on your wall either, if it's all the same to you." He looked toward the framed photograph a moment longer. "There's 61 dogs I trained after I came home, for police units and search crews and 2 fire departments over about 30 years, and not one of them has my name attached anywhere in any record, because I asked every time that it not be. That was never about hiding. That was about the credit belonging to the departments that did the real work of keeping them working after I was done with them." He met Preston's eyes. "If you want to fix something, fix that. Put those dogs' service somewhere people can read it. Say a man trained them and let it go at that. That's the whole of what I'm asking." Preston looked down at the photograph, then at Bracken, still sitting patient and unmoving against Harlan's leg, then at Logan, who had not said a word in several minutes, and looked, for the first time since Preston had known him, like a young man watching something get built rather than sold. "I can do that," Preston said. And, quieter, meaning it in a way his father's slogans had never once required of him, "I want to do that." The following Thursday, the bell over the door rang at 11:50, 10 minutes ahead of the noon signing, and this time it was Preston himself who crossed the floor to meet the man coming through it. Regional managers stood near the range in their good coats. A photographer adjusted a tripod under lighting that had, this time, been checked twice against the glare off the rifle case, and on the wall between the two mounted deer heads hung a photograph in a new frame, the brass plate replaced with one that read simply, "Corporal Harlan Sowell and his partner, in service, 1972. The training these two dogs began still protects this county." Beneath it, smaller, a second plaque listed 61 working dogs by name and department, no handler credited, exactly as asked. Preston had driven the old frame to a framer himself, 2 towns over, refusing to let Logan or anyone else do it, carrying it in the passenger seat like something that might bruise. He had softened, too, the language on the banner above the counter, founded on trust, rewritten now to read simply, "Founded in 1972, no legacy claimed that wasn't earned fresh by the people currently earning it." Logan stood behind the counter in a new shirt, with a small embroidered word above the pocket that read "Trainer," promoted a week early, and twice that Thursday morning, he caught himself glancing toward the door, the way a man watches for whether he's finally learned to read. Harlan came in not for the ceremony, but 10 minutes ahead of it, as was his habit, and crossed to the wall to look once, briefly, at the corrected photograph, at his own younger face, looking back at him honestly for the first time in 50 years. He didn't linger. He touched his coat pocket out of old habit, and found it, for once, not quite where he expected, and remembered, with something that might have been the ghost of a smile, that the clasp wasn't there. He'd left it on the counter the Wednesday before, wrapped still in its handkerchief, with no note, no instruction, only the understanding, shared without either man saying it aloud, that some things are worth leaving behind on purpose. Bracken lay in the kennel run near the back, off duty for the ceremony, ears up, but body still, holding the exact sit-stay Harlan had left him in the week before, with one open palm and a whispered word nobody else in the shop had learned to give yet. He did not rise as Harlan passed the run on his way out. He watched him go, the way a good dog watches a door it has been told, in a language older than any registration paper, to trust will open again. Harlan set his hand once against the door frame, not the bell itself, just near it, and stepped out into cold October light, with his pocket flat and empty for the first time in years, and walked home slow and unhurried down a street that didn't know yet how much of its own history it was standing on. Some debts take 50 years to come due, but they always know the way home.